Dear viewers and listeners of Khabarhub and Radio Candid, welcome to a very special interview with Dr. John Lee. Dr. John Lee is a senior fellow, non-resident at Hudson Institute and adjunct professor at Australian National University and University of Sydney. From 2016 to 2018, he was senior national security advisor to Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop. In this role, he served as the principal advisor on Asia and for economic, strategic, and political affairs in the Indo-Pacific Affairs. Dr. Lee was also appointed the Foreign Minister's lead advisor on the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper, the first comprehensive foreign affairs blueprint for Australia since 2003, and written to guide Australia's external engagement for the next 10 years and beyond. He received his doctorate in international relations from the University of Oxford. Today, we'll be discussing Australia's foreign policy with a special focus on Indo-Pacific affairs. Dr. Lee, welcome to our program. The first question today is, when it comes to Quad, how parallel are the US, Australia, Japan, and India's aspirations and goals?
First of all, thank you for having me, and I'm delighted to be with you. The Quad is really about balancing China. We have to be blunt about that. But for China's behavior over the last few years, the Quad would not have been reformed in 2017. Now, if you look at the membership of the Quad includes the 4 countries in the Indo-Pacific with the most capable navies and are the 4 countries who have all decided to counter and balance China. It is an action-orientated group which isn't slowed down by a very large membership. And there are no onerous bureaucratic processes. Also, the Quad is well aligned with the region because it does not intrude on a diplomatic space occupied by ASEAN, for example. Now, having said that, we have to be careful that Japan and Australia are American allies, while India is not. So I think one of the purposes of the Quad is to help create a strategic platform and role for India to play a larger role and presence in the region and to help balance China, but more in the Indian Ocean rather than the East Asian maritime regions.
As the final arrangements are being made for the leaders of 4 Quad countries to meet in person in Washington on September 24, what does the Quad summit signal for US engagement in the Indo-Pacific? Will the summit risk more assertiveness from the Chinese side in the region?
Well, on the back of the alliance signed between the United States, United Kingdom and Australia, or AUKUS, which was announced last week, the Quad meeting, I think, is further evidence that the United States is genuinely focused on the Indo-Pacific. And remember that this comes after the very disastrous withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan at the end of August. Now, the reason for the withdrawal from the American side was to say that they were going to be focused on the Indo-Pacific. So the Quad comes at a time that allows the United States and the Biden administration to demonstrate that it's focused on the Indo-Pacific. Now, I think the fact that it's also a face-to-face meeting between leaders is significant. It's, in fact, very significant. That broad strategic direction to focus on China and the Indo-Pacific needs to be given that direction and that authority from the top level down. And I think this is precisely what President Biden is seeking to do. Now, China is already hyper assertive. So in a sense, holding the Quad is not an additional risk because China would behave in the way it's behaving now in any event, whether there is a Quad or not. So from that point of view, I don't think the Quad is at risk of increasing Chinese assertiveness. Chinese assertiveness came before the meeting of the Quad.
What hopes does Australia have from the new security pact, AUKUS? What do you have to say about the entire ruckus over AUKUS? Does this indicate a new world order where balancing is back?
Well, Australia, I think, sees itself in a strategic period of time of immense importance and actually danger because of China's behaviour. And this means that Australia is putting more and more reliance on groupings that are actually prepared to take active risks to counter China, rather than focus on groupings where countries simply agree that China is the problem or that there's a problem in the region. Now, this is the basis for the alliance agreement AUKUS, which allows the 3 countries to pool their resources and know-how and technology in the defense industry areas. Now, it is about making good on the 2017 American decision to include the UK and Australia in the American National Industrial Technology Base, which basically means that those countries are now able to share defense-related technologies with the United States with minimal regulatory disruption. Now, with AUKUS, the focus with the announcement has been on submarines and Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines in particular. But we have to realise that Australia is not due to actually acquire any nuclear submarines until the 2030s. The more immediate priority for Australian AUKUS is actually on other weapons which can be jointly developed earlier, and this includes long-range missiles, hypersonic missiles, unmanned vehicles such as drones, offensive cyber capabilities, and military uses of artificial intelligence. Now, these capabilities will be required, or Australia thinks these capabilities will be required in the next 5 years, not in the next 10 or 20 years, but in the next 5 years, either against Chinese forces in a war in Northeast Asia, or more preferably to have the capacity to collectively deter China. That is, acquiring these capabilities will help prevent China from thinking about starting a war over Taiwan, for example. So this is where I think AUKUS will be important. Now, the ruckus is mainly caused by the termination of the submarine contract between Australia and France. I think this is related to AUKUS, but it's really a separate issue from AUKUS. AUKUS could go on with or without the submarine contract. So I think the submarine contract is not really the sum of the problem. Submarine contract is a separate disagreement between Australia and France, and Australia, France, and the United States. But I think AUKUS is probably something different altogether.
Dr. Lee, you just mentioned about scrapping the submarine deal with France. So, what is Australia's justification for scrapping the submarine deal with France? Has Australia seriously harmed itself in infuriating France?
Well, it's obviously been a very unsettling decision by Australia. But on the submarine deal, the French designed conventional submarines were to be brought into line sometime in 2035 to defend the waters quite close to the Australian territory. There is now a recognition in Canberra that Australia needs submarines to potentially take part in the conflict further away from Australia, not even in Southeast Asia, but possibly in Northeast Asia, and also to provide a strategic presence for Australia further away from the actual Australian territory. The French conventionally designed submarines would not have been in a position to do that. So Australia felt that it had to take this difficult and controversial decision because producing these conventional French built and designed submarines were not going to meet Australia's new strategic interests. Now, moreover, the French nuclear propulsion technology in its submarines, even if the French submarines were to be turned into nuclear propulsion submarines, the French technology in nuclear propulsion is not as advanced as the American or the British technologies in nuclear propulsion in submarines. And in any event, I don't think France would have given Australia its best nuclear propulsion technologies in its future submarines. So for those reasons, I think Australia has taken the difficult, but I think ultimately the strategically correct decision to change its supplier and developer of submarines.
How has Australia perceived France's decision to recall its ambassador to Australia and the US?
Well, the French are understandably furious, but I should note that there were provisions in the agreement with France for compensation to end the contract at various stages. So it was always conceivable, possible for Australia to walk away from the contract, and the French would have known that. I would also say, in all frankness, that the French were not meeting some key aspects of their obligations in terms of the timing and milestone developments of various stages of the submarine contract. So I think there was dissatisfaction from the Australian side even before this new agreement. Now, having said that, I think Australia has been surprised that France decided to recall its ambassador, which is a very dramatic move by another Western democracy. But looking ahead, France is furious, but I think Paris will have to recognise that there is a broader competition occurring, and France will need the US and the UK and even possibly Australia to confront aspects of China's behaviour in the Indo-Pacific. So yes, France is angry, but the broader challenge for France is not Australia, it's China.
But Dr. Lee, according to you, is Australian diplomacy strong enough to support its strategic intentions?
It's a very good question, and it's something which Australia is currently thinking about and discussing. The diplomatic problem is that Australia is trying to respond very quickly to changes in its strategic environment, and AUKUS is an example of that. But what that means is that there's often not enough time to ensure that our diplomatic approach is well aligned with our strategic approach. So our strategic approach has been changing rapidly. It often takes more time for our diplomatic approach to catch up, and I think that there has been a gap between our diplomacy and where we're heading strategically. So the example would be that the AUKUS agreement was signed. It really did catch the region by surprise. I think the region is now just catching up as to what it thinks of that agreement. Having said that, I think Australian external policy over the last 3 or 4 years has been driven more by defence and intelligence officials and experts than it has by our diplomats. So, for that reason as well, our diplomacy has not kept up with what we are doing. Um, I would say that Australian spending on our diplomacy has also decreased in the last few years, as some resources have been redirected to the defence and intelligence areas. So I do think there needs to be further resources put towards our diplomacy. And I would say there's hope, though. Much of the region does see China as the primary challenge as we look ahead, and there is quiet support for the sorts of things Australia is trying to do. So, yes, our diplomacy does need some work in the country, but I do think that we will spend more resources on that, and two, the region does broadly support where we're going. So I think in the medium term, I think the diplomacy will be okay.
Dr. Lee, what do you have to say about the European Union's statement suggesting Australia after this move cannot be trusted? Does this mean that NATO has become less relevant?
Well, France has certainly said that Australia can't be trusted, while the European Union just today, I think, have labels Australia's treatment of France as quite unacceptable. What I would say is that if the EU allows itself to become too focused on the cancelling of the Australian-French submarine contract, then it will be a distraction for the EU, and it will, in all likeliness, accelerate the EU's irrelevance in the Indo-Pacific. This is because Australia is not the problem for EU in the Indo-Pacific. As I mentioned, China is the problem. Now, it is true that France will take on the chair of the EU, and negotiations for an Australian EU free trade agreement will be affected. I think it will be slowed down. But that agreement was moving very slowly in any event. So I think it was already going to be a delay in the conclusion of the FTA, but now I think there'll be a further delay because of the French anger. On the issue of NATO, NATO is not currently that relevant to the Indo-Pacific. In Europe, the EU nations really have no option but to rely on the United States. So I don't think the submarine fallout will impact NATO, as in Europe, Russia is still the primary threat to the European nations. And if the EU allows NATO to become less effective due to anger against the US, not just Australia, but against the US, then the EU would obviously be compromising their own strategic interests.
Will the security pact provoke other powers in Asia? Does it signal a new arm race in the Indo Pacific region?
Well, I would say first up that China is already engaged in the most rapid rearmament in peacetime history over the past 20 years. That is, over the past 20 years, China's rearmament has been the most rapid in all of history. So AUKUS is more a response to China rather than a provocation of China or provocation of or precursor to new arms race. Now, in reality, if you look at Indo-Pacific, it's made up of a handful of big powers, that is, United States, China, Japan, and possibly India in the future. There are some very capable middle powers, such as Australia and South Korea, and then there are quite a few smaller powers. And these smaller powers cannot significantly influence the regional balance, and there is no point for these smaller powers to rapidly rearm in any event except to defend the immediate territory. So I'm not so afraid that there'll be a mass rearmament in the Indo-Pacific. I don't see an across-the-board arms race as such, but I do see the United States, Japan, Australia, India, and eventually South Korea devoting significantly more to defense spending over the next decade, largely because of China.
Dr. Lee, let me come back to France again. As the new bargain between the US, the UK, and Australia is raising eyebrows in foreign policy circles internationally. How does Australia plan to approach the new concern of the European Union and more specifically France?
Well, Canberra does need to manage French anger, and it needs to do that to ensure the EU does not back away from a continued free trade agreement negotiation with Australia. But beyond that, and to be frank, the EU is still a very limited strategic and military player when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. Now, France and the EU is extremely important when it comes to the democracies presenting a collective stance against Chinese economic activities, such as Chinese illegitimate subsidies to its firms and IP theft, intellectual property theft. But I don't think that should be affected by AUKUS, as that collective stand is actually in the EU's own interest. So my summary is that look, the EU is not overly relevant in the Indo-Pacific in strategic and military matters in any event, but we do need the EU's cooperation on global economic issues. And over time, I do expect the EU to offer that cooperation because China is actually harming the EU's longer-term economic interests.
Dr. Lee, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, and thanks again for having me.